Forget frequently asked questions.
Common sense, common knowledge, or Google.
How about advice from a real genius? 95% of people in any profession are good enough to be qualified and licensed. 5%
go above and beyond.
They become very good at what they do, but only
0.1%
are real geniuses. Richard Jacobs has made it his life's mission to find them for you. He hunts down and interviews geniuses in every field: sleep science, cancer, stem cells, ketogenic diets, and more. Here come the geniuses. This is the Finding Genius Podcast
with Richard Jacobs.
Hello, this is Richard Jacobs with the Finding Genius Podcast, now part of the Finding Genius Foundation. I have Michael Poulsen, professor of ecology and evolution at University of Copenhagen, and we're going to talk about the coevolutionary history of fungus-growing insect microbe associations, which sounds really cool. So, Mike, thanks for coming.
Yeah, thanks very much for having me. I'm excited.
If you would, tell me about your research.
Yeah, so I'm fundamentally very interested in understanding better the origin, evolution, and stability of beneficial symbiosis, so interactions, beneficial interactions between species. For various, purposes. And this is something that I've been working on for about 20 years now in a variety of different host symbiont associations, mostly in insects, but also in a few mammals and some birds. And mostly I've been working with fungus-farming ants and termites, ants that are in Central and South America, and termites in Africa and Asia. And some of the things that we focus on in my group is to understand how these different species work together, how they evolve in parallel over time, how they optimize the services they provide for each other, and how natural selection does that. And then how these complex communities are assembled and remain stable, and fundamentally how they work. And one of the things that I'm particularly interested in is understanding better how they defend themselves from diseases, which in the fungus farming termites seems to be extremely efficient. And they don't seem to have any problems with disease, which is, of course, quite a sharp contrast to how it is with us humans, for example.
Well, what kind of creatures are you talking about? What associations have you observed that are particularly interesting to you?
So the termites it's an old group. They originate about 30 million years ago in Africa, and they cultivate a specific fungus in these underground fungus gardens. And that's always just a single clone of fungus. But what we've then discovered over the years is that not only do they have this fungus, but they also have complex bacterial communities, both in the guts of the insects themselves, but also in these fungus gardens. And then we've basically been working to try to understand how specific these associations are, what roles the bacteria play, and how they in what they help the termites with, essentially. And then because they're very specific, so you have essentially, and one of the things that I find extremely interesting is that if you take colonies from even hundreds of kilometers apart, then and you take workers from these different colonies, then the composition of these bacterial communities within the gut, even though they're very diverse, there can maybe be thousands of species or strains of bacteria, then the compositions are always almost exactly the same between nests. So they seem to be very specific and very tightly regulated somehow. And we try to understand why this is the case, and why this is very important for how they work, these communities in associations with the termite.
So what do the termites do? They build fungus gardens and they cultivate fungus?
Yes, they basically so they build these mounds, and then within the mounds they have these fungal gardens, and then the termites cultivate, essentially as we cultivate crops. They cultivate this fungus on plant material that they bring back from outside the nest. So the termites then eat this substrate, this plant substrate. It can be wood or grass, and then their feces actually becomes the manure or the substrate for the fungus to grow on. And the fungus then takes care of breaking down all of the plant components, like cellulose, for example, that the termites cannot degrade themselves. And then in doing so, the fungus then grows, generates biomass, and this biomass is then what the termites eat and get nutrition from. So it's essentially like growing a fungal crop. And then the bacteria work in different ways in facilitating this process. So we know that it's clear that it's a combination of enzymes that come both from the termite host itself, also from this fungal cultivar, and from bacteria that collectively mean that the termites can utilize this plant biomass extremely efficiently. So basically, after it has been through the fungus garden and the termites have eaten the fungal biomass, there's no organic material left of what originally came in with the plant biomass. So this means they've over time been optimized to very effectively utilize this substrate and get all the nutrients out from it.
What do you believe the coevolution is? I mean, how do you believe that termites first realized they could cultivate this fungus, and how did they know that it wouldn't hurt them, or how to cultivate it? Like, how do you think all this came about?
Yeah, that's a very good question. It's hard to go back in time that way, but what we think likely happened was that the ancestors of the fungus-growing termites were also social and living in these colonies. And then likely it was at some point, coincidentally, a fungus appeared there or was close to the nest and somehow provided a benefit. So this has likely been the starting point for the origin of this association. And then it has been, because it was then likely a selective advantage, so the colonies that had this fungus, or the initial starting colony that had the fungus, did particularly well, then it has been propagated over time. So it likely started as a looser association, and then over time became very specific. So neither the fungus or the termites can actually live without each other now. So over time, they've co-evolved to become very specific and completely dependent on each other. And it's somewhat the similar pattern likely with the bacteria. So we knew that the ancestors, so all other termites, now also the ancestral cockroaches, have these complex bacterial communities in the guts. And the fungus-farming termites do as well. But these communities have then changed as a consequence of fungiculture. So they look different from what you would see in other termites. And one thing that we showed quite recently was that the bacteria no longer seem to produce a lot of the enzymes that are needed to break down cellulose, for example. So this is what the fungus is particularly good at and has the set of enzymes for. So there's likely been selection to change the microbial communities to serve other functions. And one of these functions is likely that they contribute to break down the fungal biomass. So they have a lot of these enzymes that are needed to break down and cleave the fungal cell wall rather than the plant cell wall that we see in other termites.
So the interaction between termites and the fungi, again, as a restatement, what compounds are the termites using and in what way? And what compounds are the termites giving to the fungi? Are they directly feeding them? What does the culturing look like?
Yeah, so what they do is they can use quite a broad range of different plant substrates. So it would typically be decaying wood or grass, either live or dead grass. And then they ingest it, and that serves, the termites ingest it, which serves to macerate it. So, and then they actually eat spores from the fungus at the same time. And then this mix that then becomes the feces is actually these fungal gardens that you can then see within the colony underground. So so it's essentially like a garden that they then take care of. They remove unwanted fungi so that it's extremely clean. They produce antimicrobial compounds themselves, and likely also use compounds from bacteria that contribute to inhibiting potential diseases that could spread within this fungus garden. So very much like when we use pesticides, for example, to remove weeds, or use antibiotics to prevent diseases or hit diseases that we are infected with. And this is an area that we are exploring in a lot more detail now, because in part through an European Research Council grant to understand better how the termites are so effective at preventing diseases. So as I mentioned, they don't seem to have any problems with infectious diseases. So colonies are extremely clean and very well, very well preserved in a sense. And normally you would expect that whenever you have this accumulation of resources, the fungus is a very good resource for example, pathogenic fungi or competitors. You would expect that these pathogens should try to invade and would be able to proliferate very quickly. But that doesn't seem to be the case. And what we think is happening is that the termites use this multi-layered defense. So in addition to monitoring and removing unwanted pathogens or potential pathogens or competitors manually, behaviorally, then they also have these chemical compounds themselves in glands in the head that are antimicrobial. and then likely also antimicrobial compounds that are present within these fungus gardens that seem to suppress things that come in. So that basically means that they have these multi-layers that prevent diseases from establishing.
Before we continue, I've been personally funding the Finding Genius podcast for 4.5 years now, which has led to 2,700 plus interviews of clinicians, researchers, scientists, CEOs, and other amazing people who are working to advance science and improve our lives and our world. Even though this podcast gets 100,000 plus downloads a month, we need your help to reach hundreds of thousands more worldwide. Please visit findinggeniuspodcast.com and click on Support Us. We have 3 levels of membership from $10 to $49 a month, including perks such as the ability to see ahead in our interview calendar and ask questions of upcoming guests, transcripts of podcasts you're interested in, the ability to request specific topics or guests, and more. Visit findinggeniuspodcast.com and click Support Us today. Now back to the show.
But you would then think that these diseases are selected to try to overcome these different barriers, but that doesn't seem to be the case. So they must be doing this in an extremely sustainable way and in a way that prevents resistance evolving. And this is what we're trying to address now by looking at what chemical compounds are actually present within the fungal gardens to understand better whether or not the termites use compounds from themselves, from bacteria, or even from the fungal cultivar to prevent diseases from invading and spreading. And it looks like it's a combination.
You don't know yet, or do you know? Go ahead.
Well, we have we have a lot of indications that there are many chemical compounds there. So over the years, we've isolated a lot of bacteria that produce antimicrobial compounds. We've also discovered a lot of new compounds in collaborations with chemists who are doing the structural elucidation. And we recently showed that if you do chemical extractions from these complex communities, then you get a very large number of chemical features or likely chemical compounds present. And many of these are related to metabolism. It can also be amino acids, etc. But a lot of them are likely to be small molecules that could be antimicrobial. So it really looks like that what antagonists would meet when they enter a fungus comb like this is a complex mixture of compounds that are very hard to overcome. So if many of these have antimicrobial properties, then it's like using a lot of different antibiotics in one go, which makes it very difficult for pathogens to overcome or to establish and obtain resistance. So we think this is probably a key point, this use of multiple compounds simultaneously to help prevent pathogens from establishing.
Have you characterized the fungi to look to see if there's only one species that is cultivated by the termites, or have you looked at the microbiome, for instance, of the termites and see, interaction with the fungi before and after, how it changes their microbiome? There might be some interesting, metabolites back and forth or interactions there.
Yeah, that's actually a very good question, and we're working on that at the moment actually. So it's quite interesting that a colony is started by a king and a queen. So they come from their natal nest or their parent nest, and then they meet up and they signal to each other using pheromones. When they find each other, they start the nest, and it's long been assumed that they also bring bacteria with them in the guts. And in some species, they bring the fungus as well, and they start the fungus garden right away. But in most species, they actually don't bring the fungus. So they just start with bacterial communities, and they live off the resources they basically have in their bodies for a period of time, several months before the first workers then will go out into the environment, bring back substrate, and accidentally or coincidentally bring back a fungus as well that they then establish. So we're right now looking at exactly what the composition is of the microbes in these kings and queens when they come from their parent nests and when they establish the colonies. And then in a different project, looking at what happens when you have this shift from a young colony where you only have the king and queen and a few workers and the first soldiers, and then afterwards when they get the fungus established. So it's very likely that the compositions, so you would expect to have different needs for the insects before and after, because they don't have the fungal source to eat from. So it's very likely that bacteria compensate by helping break down plant components, for example, or obtaining nutrition from this plant soil mix that they eat before they get the fungus to change afterwards once the fungus garden is. But essentially nothing is known about these details at the moment, but we're working on a couple of projects to try to understand this better.
If you like this podcast, please click the link in the description to subscribe and review us on iTunes.
Well, ants do the same thing, right? They culture fungus in some of their nests, certain kinds of ants.
Yeah, so there's this monophyletic group of ants in Central and South America that do the same, and they've also been very successful, and they've become dominant herbivores in the New World. And they actually here queens will actually bring the fungus with them. So she will start a colony fungusgarden with a small piece of fungus from the colony she came from. So this means she has the fungus present immediately, in contrast with the termites, where we mostly see them establish the fungus comb later on. And one really interesting difference between the two systems, even though they are in parallel, there are a lot of similarities because of the way they cultivate fungus externally. They use plant biomass as the substrate for the fungus, and they associate with bacteria as well that likely play important roles. But in contrast to the termites, there's a specific fungal pathogen in the ants that seems to have co-evolved to specifically use the ant fungus as its host. And this pathogen is potentially quite virulent, so it can have quite a big effect on colonies. And the ants have several different defense mechanisms in place to try to cope with this disease. And one of them, and this was actually the main focus of my postdoc work, is bacteria growing on the bodies of the ants, and these bacteria produce antimicrobial compounds. And this was actually when it was first discovered back in '99. What really triggered my interest in these defensive symbioses, where you have bacteria producing antimicrobials to help fight the disease.
But do you think that it's accidental? I mean, it seems like the ants certainly know, and once the fungus is there, they work with it, and the termites do too. So how could it be accidental?
No, they certainly recognize the presence of the fungus. It's more a question of whether or how they get it, I guess, established in the beginning. And we think in the termites that it's unlikely that they will be able to recognize spores of the fungus in the environment, but that it's more coincidental that they bring spores back, and then once the fungus starts growing, they recognize the right fungus, and then they specifically grow the species that they're used to grow and that they have adapted to grow.
Yeah, but they should be exposed to multiple different types of spores out in the environment, right? Like, where does this fungus grow normally? Yeah,
that's very true. I mean, so the fungi do not grow elsewhere. So from mature colonies, you will have mushrooms produced by the fungus in the termites, not in the ants. And these mushrooms spread sexual spores to the environment, which means that there's likely spores of a number of different fungal species in the environment that the termites will then bring back to the nest. But then only spores from the species that they are adapted to use will actually successfully establish and ultimately dominate this community of fungi. And then you go from a mix from the beginning of different fungal clones to having a single monoculture of the species that the termite species is adapted to maintain. So you're absolutely right. It's not coincidental. It might be coincidental what comes in the beginning, but then natural selection has adapted the termites to only be able to utilize this specific fungus.
So there's no evidence of this fungus being around in nature. It's only found in termite nests?
Yeah, so there's no evidence that it exists elsewhere, no.
Well, how do nests interact? Do they? How do termites... I mean, it's one obvious path is the new king and queen have their own fungus that they take with them, but how does it get into another colony? Are there colonies with no fungus? Are there colonies with different types of fungus?
So in some species, so the kings and queens, when they will come from different nests when they fly out, and then they find each other and start a new nest. And then in some species, either the queen will bring a small bit of fungus in her gut, or the king will do so. And then you get the fungus transmitted from generation to generation like that. But in most species, it seems like it's this process where it's the first workers of the new nest that goes into the environment and brings back the substrate that then has these spores. So this will, of course, mean that some will not be successful in actually establishing. So because it's a fragile period of time, in the colony life, and they will have to get the fungus garden established, otherwise the colony will die. So in addition to many of these kings and queens will be killed, either eaten by predators, or they will succumb to fungal infections in this early period of their lives. But from the colonies where the king and queen both survive, then it's likely that, or very likely that only a fraction will actually make it to get a fungus garden and ultimately grow to maturity. So many will likely die at these early stages. And this is also, so you could say that this is of course a bit of a waste, but it's in a way the same way as when we have, when trees send out millions and millions of pollen, only a few will actually fertilize, or a few seeds will germinate and generate a new tree. And the same way, the termite colonies will send out thousands of prospective new kings and queens, and only a small fraction of them will actually make it to establish a nest and have a mound that grows to maturity, to then reproduce again by producing its own males and females.
Is there any evidence of fungal competition? So a king and a queen, I would think that a lot of times they would both have a little bit of fungus in them. They start a new colony together. Is there competition among the fungus? I mean, even if it's the same fungus, there would be epigenetic changes in the fungus in two different nests, and then it comes together, and then what happens?
That's a very good point, and that's precisely why we think that it's either only the king or the queen that brings the fungus. So you would expect that if they both bring a fungus, then they would compete for being the one that dominates in the colony, and this is essentially similar logic as to why we only have mitochondria being transmitted from the maternal line in us, for example, but not from the father, and essentially to avoid competition. So natural selection has likely led to this, to making sure that it's only one parent that brings it, likely to prevent this competition. And then in one case, so it's evolved independently twice, and in one case it was then the queen that ended up with the fungus. In the other case, it was the king, kind of supporting this idea that you would only have uniparental transmission.
Well, if the workers are exposed to spores out in the environment, and that theory is right, then wouldn't they continuously be bringing in fungi that are different from the one that are in the nest? So there'd be a continual competition, I would think.
Yeah, that's a very good point too. So that's also why it was initially it was a bit puzzling why you would bring in different fungal clones. And the explanation likely is that it's beneficial for the termites to bring in different fungal clones in this early stages where the fungus garden needs to be established, and then basically let the fungi compete with each other. And then the fungus that will grow the best and produce most new spores that for inoculation of the new substrate will then be the one that outcompetes the others. And this is what seems to be the case. So this seems to have been selected for because it then allows the termites to essentially shop for a range of different fungal clones, and then let the environment, and their, of course, also what the termites do, what substrate is available, what they bring in, the specific environmental conditions within the combs, etc., select for which fungus is the best one given the environmental conditions and the host association. So this is that's the idea for why this has been selected for over evolutionary time.
Well, if you look at different nests, what does the condition of the fungus look like? Are the species the same? Do termite nests happen in very different conditions? Some are moister, some are hotter. I know they build their mounds to try to control the environment, but is the condition of a mound very different amongst mounds?
Within the same termite species, probably quite consistent between mounds, because they, as you say, regulate extremely well to both humidity, temperature, carbon dioxide levels, etc. So within a termite species, they will likely be very similar. So that also means that, and that's also why you see that a specific termite species is associated with likely one in most cases, possibly a few closely related species of fungus in some cases. So you have quite a narrow set of potential fungal symbionts. But then if you compare across termite species and genera, so there are about 330 described fungus-farming termite species, then you see quite big differences in the conditions. and also in which fungal species you see. So at the moment, there are about 40 Termites, the species, so this the mutualistic fungus species, and they specifically associate with specific termite genera or species. So likely driven exactly by this combination of conditions, being able to survive gut passage, which they need to as well, of the specific termite host they associate with.
Interesting. Okay. Have you observed any pathology in the fungus in various termite colonies? And can you figure out why there is such, like, are there diseases that affect the fungi in certain colonies, or in certain ones it just fails to flourish for some reason?
It's we've explored that quite a bit, because it's kind of fundamentally seems puzzling that there shouldn't be diseases, and we haven't really come up with any good candidates that seem to have any effect on otherwise functioning nests. But what we do know is that there's a specific fungal species that seems to be quite common with the alates, so these wen kings and queens flies. So they will often get fungal infections, one of these insect entomopathogenic fungi. And then we know that even if colonies look healthy, there are other fungi in there that are just completely suppressed, so they don't grow. But then if the colony is compromised, for example, by an aardvark, or if the termites die and the fungus is left unmanaged, then these other fungi will proliferate very quickly. So it seems that rather than having a pathogenic strategy, these fungi have actually evolved to have kind of a stowaway life cycle or life history, which means that they enter and they are not completely removed, but they're also not imposing any symptoms or any disease outbreaks until there's an opportunity. For example, if the termites die, or you get the mound disturbed heavily for one reason or another. And then they proliferate very quickly and can then spread their own spores to the environment and ultimately come in to other mounds when the termites forage for substrate. So this suggests that indeed there are organisms that take advantage of this accumulation of resources, but not in a way as we see it in diseases in humans, for example, or as the way we see it in the ants, where you have a strong effect of infections in colonies and this constant battle of suppression. So it's only
have people tried to culture this? I mean, what's the name of the fungus, by the way, that grows there? And have people tried to culture it on their own in the lab?
Yeah, Termites, the beneficial fungus. Yeah. Oh,
so have you tried to culture it? Yeah, like have you tried to culture it in your lab or?
Yeah, so we can grow it on artificial media, not as mushrooms but as mycelium. And we do that for a range of different projects, looking both at, and actually also testing at the moment, if this fungus has antimicrobial compounds itself that could inhibit other things from growing, which seems to be the case. What, of course, would be really ideal is if we could somehow grow mushrooms. And because these mushrooms are very delicious and they're very high in protein, so it's actually the more protein rich than chicken meat, and it's healthier for human consumption, and also very tasty. But that hasn't been possible to do yet, and that's probably because we basically don't know well enough exactly what the conditions are within the fungus-growing termite mound that are required for the mushrooms to form. But it is something that we would like to explore more, and I have also collaborations in Nigeria and elsewhere where we are talking about if we can try to mimic these conditions in order to create an artificial environment where we could potentially get mushrooms forming. Because it could be
so the only way to get mushrooms is to have the termites cultivate them. Humans can't do it.
At the moment, humans cannot do it. No, so that's the only way. So people, especially in rural Africa, they're quite important for the local economies, and different termite species, or the fungus from different termite species will make mushrooms at different times during the year. So you can almost have mushrooms all year round, but it will be from different Termites species because of the differences in the life history. And basically, when people find a colony, find a mound, you will have, because these colonies can get at least 5 to 7, possibly up to 15 to 20 years old, you will basically have mushrooms coming every year from the same nest. So when people find them, they're also very protective of them. So which in a sense is also good for us, both good and bad. It's good for us in that people don't get rid of them. as we often do with termites, of course. But they're also a bit hesitant to let us dig into these colonies because they're worried that we might prevent the colonies from producing mushrooms again.
So again, people cannot get them to make mushrooms. You have to have a termite colony do it in order to get the mushroom phase, right?
Yeah.
So what do you think is being passed to the from the termites to the fungi, or what do you think signals the fungi to go into the fruiting body stage? I mean, usually I thought it's consumption of the substrate, but it sounds like there's more to it than that.
Yeah, that's also a very good question. I mean, it's probably a combination of different things. So so mushrooms will typically form shortly after the alates, so these kings and queens have left the mound, which led us to speculate that maybe it's a question of basically having less termites eating from the fungus that then means that you don't have this suppression of mushrooms, but then the fungus can produce the mushroom. But it doesn't seem like this is the full story, at least, because the fungus normally in these gardens make these small nodules, these small balls of mycelium. That is what the termites feed on, and this is what we see in most fungus gardens. But then occasionally you see these differently shaped nodules that are more pointy, and this seems to really be the primordial for the mushrooms. So the starting point for these mushrooms. So it seems to be a different pathway to having the mushroom formed than it is the normal nodules that feed the termites. But of course, a lot of things likely change when you have a reduction in the number of termites present within the mound. So you would have a reduction in of course, activity and grooming and eating of the fungus, but you would likely also have differences in CO2 levels, imagining if all of a sudden 10,000 individuals leave the nest. So it could very well be a trigger like that elicits the starting point of the primordial. And what we would really like to do is to monitor the environment within the fungus gardens. And this is something we're planning, but this has been delayed because of Corona, to monitor this airspace around the fungus comb to see what the composition is, for example, what oxygen levels, carbon dioxide levels, and volatile compounds from the fungus actually are around in this environment. And it would be ideal to check or to test what changes significantly before or in this process before the alates fly out until you get the mushrooms forming, to see if we can explore what conditions these different actions are associated with.
Okay, very good. What do you expect in the next year or two that you're going to figure out? Are you close on any of these questions we talked about?
So some of the aspects that we, so like I mentioned, there are several things kind of in the pipeline. And one of the things that we are working a lot on at the moment is fungal genomes. So we have sequenced 25 or so of these Termites genomes, and we're looking at now exploring what the genes they encode for, including also these potential antimicrobial. So I think we'll have a much better idea of the potential for the fungus to contribute to defending itself essentially from competitors within these mounds, and hopefully be able to also obtain these headspace measurements of compounds in the area around them.
Okay. Well, very good. What's the best way for people to find out more about your work in general? Where can they go?
Well, so we always, we have both a Facebook page. So the group that I lead is called the Social and Symbiotic Evolution Group at the University of Copenhagen. And we both have a website and a Facebook page as well. And we're more than welcome to follow us there. So we post both, or mainly we post on new publications, projects either that have been finalized or upcoming, or if we're looking for master students, things like that, or if we have new positions in the group.
Okay. Well, very good. Well, Michael, thank you for coming. It's, I guess some would consider it arcane, but it's really interesting what you're working on. So thank you.
Well, thank you very much.
If you like this podcast, please click the link in the description to subscribe and review us on iTunes.
You've been listening to the Finding Genius podcast with Richard Jacobs. If you like what you hear, be sure to review and subscribe to the Finding Genius podcast on iTunes or wherever you listen to podcasts. And want to be smarter than everybody else? Become a premium member at findinggeniuspodcast.com. This podcast is for information only. No advice of any kind is being given. Any action you take or don't take as a result of listening is your sole responsibility. Consult professionals when advice is needed.